So good morning, and thank you all for being here. I had the opportunity, I've been in my role for about 3 years as Executive Director of NSEA, and as a part of that, I enter into a network of Executive Directors throughout the country. And one of my mentors in the work that we do is Audrey Soglin, who's the Executive Director of the Illinois Education Association. And Audrey has been one of the leaders in the country around trauma-informed work, and that became important to her. She realized the issue not only because of the fact that she was a teacher for 25 years, a special education teacher, as well as taught K through 5, but she also was in a conversation with her brother David, who's a pediatrician. He's actually the chief medical officer of La Barbida Children's Hospital. He's been practicing for over 35 years, and they were at a family event and began talking about what they were seeing and saw a crossover between what he was seeing in his pediatric practice and what people were dealing with in the schools. And they realized that it was really a time for them to come together and bring their networks together to address that issue. And so Audrey became actually the president of the Partnership for Resilience, and they've done a lot of really good work in Illinois, both in an urban and a rural setting, to deal with the issues of childhood trauma. And so we asked them to come here and be with us today to talk about both the research behind this and to begin to give us a bit of a guidepost. What are they doing? What can we learn from them? I always say the best ideas in education are borrowed and stolen from others. There are people out there who are doing good work around how we can help kids who are struggling with trauma, families who are struggling with trauma. And so we want to learn from them, we want to borrow from them as we begin to address this issue in a real and meaningful way across the state of Nebraska. So they have flown in from Chicago. Thank goodness it was this week and not last week, right? Don't like the weather in Nebraska, wait 5 minutes. And so I'd like you to join me in welcoming them. David and Audrey, please.
Thank you, Jenny and Maddie, for inviting us. We're happy to be here. And one of the things that we do like to say and let everyone know is there's a lot of expertise in this room. Every time we go someplace and just share our story, we learn much more than we actually impart to you. So we're excited to be here, and we just give you our story to see if there's some relevance for you as you move forward. As Maddie said, we started, we were at my house for like a barbecue, and we suddenly realized that, gosh, pediatricians and educators, hey, maybe they could work together to help kids. Why it took us so long, we're not sure. I tell people, he's been my brother my whole life. He's been a doctor for over 35 years. I've been teaching, as he likes to say, for a little longer. But it did. It dawned on us, and we started to work together. So the first thing that, and the way this is going to go is I'm going to talk just through a couple slides, and then I'm going to turn it over to David, and he does sort of the medical health piece, the research around the medicine and health piece, and then I'll move back to the education, what we can do. And sometimes we'll jump a little bit, so we hope we don't drive you crazy. But we started this work in an era where the focus for educational reform was really on the people, the teacher, on systems that affected the teaching, like dismissal processes, evaluation processes, like every room needs a great teacher, and those were all important. Curriculum's important. All of that is important. It's just not sufficient. So you'll never hear me, as the executive director of the IEA, you'll never hear me say those things aren't critical. They are, but they're just not sufficient. So, and this sort of says the same thing, that in spite of 20 years of educational reform and 10 years focused on academic press or student achievement, the academic side and the learning side, there really has been no significant narrowing of the achievement gap. So that has been part of my life, trying to figure out how to educate all the children that were both in front of me and in front of our colleagues and our members now in Illinois And so when we began this work, we started to really look at the research of ACEs, the adverse childhood experiences, and the significant impact that those kinds of experiences and toxic stress had on kids' ability to learn. So this is why we took a little bit of it resonated with me when David started to talk about the research and the science. I did not know about this. This was in 2014. Having been in this field for my entire adult life, I didn't know about this study. I didn't know about the research. And I found, as we were talking to educators across the state of Illinois, they didn't either. So the first thing that we began to do is to raise awareness. And then from there, we'll begin to tell you more of our story. But I'm going to turn this over to David, as he's going to talk about the science.
Thank you very much. I'm equally pleased to be here. So in 1998, Drs. Folletti and Anda published a landmark study on what is called ACEs, Adverse Childhood Experiences. Basically, they did a 10-question survey on adverse childhood experiences and compared those results to adult health. They had 17,000 participants through Kaiser Permanente, so they were all insured. They were mostly white, mostly college educated, and mostly middle class. The ACEs that they chose to ask about are these 10 things: physical, sexual, and emotional abuse, physical and emotional neglect, and then what they called household dysfunction. So living in a house with domestic violence or substance abuse, a parent with mental illness, divorce or separation, or a family member incarcerated. Those were the 10 adverse childhood experiences that Folletti and Anda chose to ask about. And what were the results? Only 1 out of 3 of those 17,000 respondents had grown up with 0 ACEs. So most people have at least 1 ACE. 1 out of 6 had a score of 4 or more. 1 out of 9 had a score of 5 or more. And keep in mind that you just get 1 point for each one of those 10 things. So if you've been physically abused, you get 1 point, whether that happened for a brief period of your life or whether that happened for all 16, 17 years of your childhood. That's still just 1 point. So a lot of trauma out there is the clear message. And there's actually a heavier burden, which we've learned subsequently in a 2016 study on minority children and on children growing up in poverty. 75% of children who live in a household with annual income greater than 400% of the federal poverty line, 75% of them had no ACEs, and only 38% of children growing up in poverty, less than 200% of the federal poverty line, only 38% of them have no ACEs. So the burden isn't equally distributed, but everybody's involved. And they found a graded impact on adult disease: increased risk of heart disease, increased risk of stroke, increased risk of obesity, cancer, chronic lung disease, mortality. And I just want to remind people, these are risks. Doesn't mean that everyone who experienced ACEs is going to have heart disease or be obese. Doesn't mean everyone with heart disease or obesity had childhood ACEs. These are risks. So in a population of people who had 4 or more ACEs, there is a greater risk that any one individual is going to have heart disease or obesity or whatever it is. In the population of people with 6 or more ACEs, they have a reduced longevity of 20 years. So they're living 20 years less than a population of people with no ACEs, as a group. Doesn't mean anything about any one individual. And to put that into perspective, chronic cigarette smoking reduces longevity by 10 years. 6 or more ACEs reduces longevity by 20 years. So just last month, the CDC put out a study looking at what the impact of ACEs are on adult health. So what they did was they calculated what the percentage of risk, of what they called attribution risk, was for a number of different disease states. So what they determined was that 2% of the overweight and obesity problem in America would be gone if there were no ACEs. If no children experienced ACEs, there'd be 2% less obesity. That's 2.5 million less obese Americans. Coronary artery disease, if there were no ACEs, there'd be 12% less coronary artery disease in the world, in the States. Almost 2 million less people with coronary artery disease. A 24% reduction in stroke. They didn't tell me how many people that would involve. A 27% reduction in chronic obstructive pulmonary disease, chronic lung disease. A 44% reduction in depression. 44% of depression is attributable to childhood adversity. 21 million less Americans depressed if there were no ACEs. Almost 5% of the risk of dropping out of school before graduating high school is attributable to ACEs. 1.5 million more high school graduates, and almost 15% of unemployment is attributable to ACEs. So a huge impact. This was a study done on 63,000 adults across 25 states, so it seems pretty reliable to me. And it had similar populations to what we've talked about from the original Folletti and Anda study. These numbers are based on completely eliminating ACEs. So from 4 or more down to 0. But we know that even if you could get 4 or more down to 3, for example, we would cut depression by 23%. Half of that number would be eliminated if we could even get kids down to 3 adverse experiences instead of 4 or more. So I'm going to run through a few quick slides demonstrating the relationship between ACEs as a child and adult health or health behaviors. So the risk of smoking goes up the more ACEs you have. The risk of depression goes up the more ACEs you have. The risk of alcoholism. The risk of having impaired worker performance goes up the more ACEs you have. And it has dramatic impacts on child health as well. It's not just on adult health. So we see language and other behavioral and other developmental delays. We see behavior problems. We see more injuries, more obesity, more somatic complaints. That's those kids who are always complaining of stomach aches and headaches. Frequently those are tied to school absences, so impacts on education there. And the relationship between ACEs and ADHD is really interesting because it seems like ACEs actually increase the risk of ADHD, but also the way children who've experienced trauma behave in the world looks a lot like ADHD. So it can be very confusing to differentiate those two. So the original ACEs study was remarkable, landmark, changing the landscape. But remember, they just chose to look at those 10 issues. They didn't look at any other adversity in childhood. So actually, it underestimates the presence of adversity in a child's life. It was focused on adult outcomes, and it was completely focused on deficits, on adversity, not on why don't even more people with 6 or more ACEs have these issues? What makes some people resilient in the face of all those ACEs? So they didn't look at that at all. But we know what they were really looking at in 1998 wasn't those 10 ACEs, it was toxic stress. So we talk about 3 different kinds of stress. The positive stress, that's that brief increase in your heart rate and your blood pressure, increase in stress hormones that helps improve performance. Athletes depend on it. That's why Audrey and I were up here at the beginning changing our slides, right? That's that positive stress. We looked at it again this morning, even though we looked at it on the plane last night and 2 weeks ago, and we found more things we wanted to change. Positive stress. Tolerable stress is that more serious, but still temporary stress, and it's buffered by a positive relationship. So your boss is a jerk, things suck at work, but you go home and your dog loves you, and hopefully your partner does too. Toxic stress is that strong, persistent activation of the body's stress response with no protective adult support in a child's life. That's toxic stress. And toxic stress is really what we're talking about. We're not talking about those 10 adverse experiences. So in addition to those 10 ACEs, we really need to be thinking about the causes of toxic stress in the world. We know that poverty is a cause of toxic stress. And, as I just told you, increases the risk of having other ACEs. We know that systemic racism is a cause of toxic stress. We know that living in a community with violence, being bullied, there are a host of other toxic stresses that Folletti and Anda didn't know to ask about. So we really should be thinking about the adverse childhood experiences and adverse community experiences. So our stress activation system is designed for the fight, flight, or freeze response, which is great if you're being attacked by a bear, right? You want your heart rate up, you want your blood pressure up, you want to run as fast as you can to get away from the situation. If you get attacked, you want your immune response activated so that if you do get a wound, it heals quickly. That's great. That's what you want in the moment of a bear attack. Not so great if your cause of stress is chronic, changing your body and your brain wiring, and not so great if you're a 60-something-year-old man, the source of stress is your boss, and your clotting system activates and closes off that coronary artery. Less positive response. Probably better than a bear attack, but not great. So how does toxic stress cause these problems? We know there's adverse childhood experiences, which I would now replace with toxic stress. Causes disrupted neurodevelopment, changes the wiring of the brain, affects your social, emotional, and cognitive functioning, with adoption of health risk behaviors, more smoking, more alcohol, more obesity, we talked about that, leading to disease, disability, and social problems, and ultimately early death. But we also know that that activated inflammatory system bypasses the adoption of health risk behaviors. People who don't smoke, who aren't overweight, who don't drink, but have a lot of toxic risk for early disease, disability, and death. So I'm going to show you a video. Some of you have probably seen this before. It's called the still face experiment.
Babies this young are extremely responsive to the emotions and the reactivity and the social interaction that they get from the world around them. This is something that we started studying 30, 40 years ago, when people didn't think that infants could engage in social interaction. In the still face experiment, what the mother did was she sits down and she's playing with her baby, who's about a year of age.
I'm like a girl. Oh.
And she gives a greeting to the baby gives a greeting back to her.
Yeah.
This baby starts pointing at different places in the world, and the mother's trying to engage her and play with her. They're working to coordinate their emotions and their intentions, what they want to do in the world. And that's really what the baby is used to. And then we ask the mother to not respond to the baby. The baby very quickly picks up on this, and then she uses all of her abilities to try and get the mother back. She smiles at the mother. She points because she's used to the mother looking where she points. The baby puts both hands up in front of her and says, "What's happening here?" She makes that screechy sound at the mother, like, "Come on, why aren't we doing this?" Even in this 2 minutes, when they don't get the normal reaction, they react with negative emotions, they turn away, they feel the stress of it. They actually may lose control of their posture because of the stress that they're experiencing.
Okay. I'm here. Oh, yes. Oh, what a big girl.
It's a little like the good, the bad, and the ugly. The good is that normal stuff that goes on, that we all do with our kids. The bad is when something bad happens, but the infant can overcome it. After all, when you stop the still face, the mother and the baby start to play again. The ugly is when you don't give the child any chance to get back to the good. There's no reparation, and they're stuck in that really ugly situation.
So I've shown that video a ton of times. I've seen it even more, and it chokes me up every time. So imagine not being that baby, but being a baby whose household is like that. Whether that's because of maternal depression, alcohol or drug use, poverty and people working 2 or 3 jobs, and that's the response that that baby gets in their life. Just imagine what that does to a baby, but we don't have to imagine it because we actually know. It changes the wiring of their brain. So this is called a functional MRI, and what you see on this side is a healthy child's functional MRI. That tells us where the blood flow is going, what parts of the brain are active. And you can see there's a lot of activity in the frontotemporal area, the prefrontal area. That's where executive function takes place. That's where decision making happens. That's where learning occurs. That's where delay in gratification occurs. That's all your executive function, all the important things we want children to be able to do. The other side is a functional MRI of a child who grew up in a Romanian orphanage. I don't know how many of you remember, I think it was in about the 90s that we learned about the Romanian orphanages. In the Romanian orphanages, all of the physical needs of children got met. They got fed, they got, water, they got their diapers changed, but they had no physical affection, no interaction, almost no activity in the prefrontal cortex, so critical to decision making and executive function. So what happens when people can't delay gratification, aren't good at making decisions, which is what happens when people have experienced ACEs for long periods of time? You can see that teenagers start intercourse earlier. The more ACEs they have, more likely to get pregnant or more likely to impregnate somebody. They're also more likely to commit crimes for that same impulsive reason. Kids in the Florida juvenile juvenile justice system, compared to the scores in Folletti and Anda's original study, instead of almost 40% having 0 ACEs, about 3% of kids in the Florida juvenile justice system have 0 ACEs, and 50% of kids involved with juvenile justice have 4 or more ACEs. Their brain's been rewired, they're making bad decisions. And this slide I particularly like because it demonstrates, it's not so much about ACEs in particular, but it demonstrates the impact of physical abuse, sexual abuse, living with domestic violence, and poverty on mental health problems in adult women. There's an identical slide in adult men. This is from the Child Adversity Narrative organization. That red line across the middle there, where it says odds ratio equals 1.4, they marked that because that's the risk of secondhand smoke. So a non-smoker who works in an environment where there's a lot of secondhand smoke has an increased risk of lung cancer or cigarette smoke-induced disease of 1.4, so 40% higher than someone who doesn't have exposure to cigarette smoke. We decided that that risk, 1.4 odds ratio, was too high to allow smoking in restaurants, bars, or workplaces. 1.4. But look at the risk just of poverty. For PTSD, over 2. For conduct disorder, poverty, 3.5. For childhood ADHD, odds ratio of 3. That's just for poverty. Physical abuse, sexual abuse, exposure to domestic violence, all of those things increase the risks of significant mental health issues in adults. And there's real financial implications as well. So I'm a pediatrician, I'm not a finance guy, although my CFO likes to think I am. But the Perryman Group is a financial analysis group, and they took a look at the lifetime costs of child maltreatment, of child abuse. And they added the social costs, such as additional health care needs, increased social welfare costs, increased crime, increased expenses in the educational system, as well as lost earnings and productivity. And what they calculated was that over the lifetime of a maltreated child, it cost society $1.8 million in social costs and in lost income. And it loses about 8.5 lost years of employment per child. In Illinois, that worked out to 1.2 million person years of employment lost, just in Illinois alone. I'll have to figure out what it was for Nebraska.
We're going to switch a little bit now and talk about what happens in schools. And I think that this slide, I'm hoping everybody can read it, but what it really says is that food insecure children, they're more likely to be behind in social skills and reading performance in kindergarten. By elementary school, they're 4 times more likely to need mental health counseling, and those risks keep accumulating. So it's been malnutrition from childhood food insecurity has been also linked to adult diseases. And the stress and anxiety of childhood hunger makes it harder to learn skills that help relationship development, school success, and workplace productivity. How many, we have a lot of schools in Illinois who provide backpacks full of food for kids on Fridays. They bring, so that the kids have food on the weekend, and they bring the empty backpack back on Monday so that the kids can have something to eat on the weekend, so that they're not worrying about whether or not they are going to be hungry over the weekend. And I'm seeing a lot of nodding of heads. Looks like you guys do the same thing. So schools are trying to directly impact this issue, food insecurity, that comes with poverty. You know this better than me, but I think it's really important to really get the context of what is happening in your state. So I'm not going to read this to you, but you've got 13% of families with incomes below the federal poverty level. 22,000 children live in families with income less than $12,000, almost $13,000 a year. So poverty in Nebraska is real, and your schools are seeing the children who are living in really, really poor kids. And this just breaks it down by your counties, so you can see where it falls. That goes from 9% to 22%, with an average of 17% of children. And so this Kids Count Data Center, they provide a lot of these statistics for every state. So it's really a really good resource if you're interested. No vehicle. That's a risk factor for the adults in terms of taking multiple buses or finding other ways to get to work, going to the grocery store. That somebody who works maybe 1 or 2 full-time jobs and is trying to feed their family in the right way and is trying to get to school for the conferences, that's all parts, all of that leads to more stress. And then you've got a fifth of kids who get some form of public assistance. So this is Dr. John Medina. He wrote a book called Brain Rules. And he says that when a child is living in toxic stress, they cannot do these things physiologically. They aren't able to do the things that we want them to do in school, in other places. And the hard thing for teachers, because it was certainly hard for me, I wished that I knew this when I was teaching. I wish that I knew this, that the ability to learn, the ability to react is literally out of their control because of the physiological reaction that's happening in the moment. And I know that I said to a lot of children, you made the wrong decision. You know, you could have walked away, you chose not to, you hit someone, you struck out, you kicked. Because I thought that it was in everyone's control. All these kids had self-control. They could either use it or not. I didn't understand that in some cases, children's brains were being flooded with cortisone, adrenaline, and were unable to respond appropriately. I didn't know that, and I really wished that I did. I think I would have been a better teacher. One story that I like to tell, because I was teaching and my kids were outside for recess. You know, they had lunch first and then they went outside to recess, and now they're coming back to my class and I'm supposed to be teaching math. And I must have had 6 other adults bringing kids to me saying they were fighting here and they were yelling. And I just said to the whole class, I said, look, we're going to have to figure out how to get along at recess. And one child said to me, why are you looking at me? And I said, okay, you know, I wasn't. I was talking to the class as a whole, and I repeated it, and I looked up. Okay, that was my strategy. I don't know if it's a good one, but I'm like, okay, I'm going to say this again so you know I'm not talking to you. I looked up and I said the same thing. But that was a child who was, you know, I knew where the problems that he had at home, his parents were trying. I mean, I knew all of that existed. And I think what was happening is he was ready. He was ready to fight. He was ready to fight back, to protect himself, to deal with this in a very intellectual way, like I was trying to. We're going to have to figure it out. We'll talk about it. That's not where he was. So he responded in that way. So this is high school sophomores and seniors, and this was a study done in a Washington State classroom. And if you look, this just is the average. This doesn't mean that, you know, it happens in every class. But if you look, the very top row is the number of children without ACEs. Okay, so there's 6. This is a classroom of 30. You have 6 kids with 0 ACEs, and then as you move up to the class, you see the numbers increase. So if you look at starting at the 4th row down, you start seeing children with 3 ACEs, 4 ACEs, 5 and 6. So that's a lot of kids with a number of issues. And it's just important to recognize that we have children sitting in our classrooms who have serious trauma going on in their lives. And these are older kids. And then this just shows you the ACEs in academics, number of risk factors, and when ACEs rise, academics fall. There's significant adversity impairs development in the first 3 years, and number of risk factors. You can see as the number of ACEs that you have. This is sort of cumulative, right? You stack them on each other, and the number having 3 or 4 starts to tip the scale in terms of the amount of risk that a child has. And this, I just thought, this is just important because it looks at the prison. This is a prison. So 1 in every 15 black males, 18 or older, is incarcerated. 1 in every 36 Hispanic males is incarcerated, and 1 in every 106 white males is incarcerated. So if you go back to one of the slides that David showed about if you can, those risk factors, the frontal cortex, making bad decisions, there's a price to pay. There is a price to pay for our young, these are 18 or older, for our young adults. They're paying a price for growing up in households with adverse childhood experiences. All right, this is a movie.
We're not even going to try it.
Right, so.
Would you come help us? That's probably enough. It's enough for me. The first time I was shown something like that, I didn't even realize I was watching the same video. I mean, and she showed them like immediately after each other, just like I just did. And it took me a little while before I realized it was the same video. And what the speaker at that conference said to us was that children who've experienced toxic stress walk around with shark music playing in their heads. And for some reason, despite all the research I've read about toxic stress, seeing that and that phrase of hers really brought it home for me. My head of behavioral health at La Rabida has a phrase I keep telling him to stop using, although then I keep repeating it, so I'm not sure what that says about me, but he says the rat is always right. And what he means by that is that if you've got a rat that cowers in the corner of their cage every time it hears a high-pitched noise, you could say to yourself, what is the matter with that rat? Or you could say to yourself, what happened to that rat that it is afraid of high-pitched noises? And learn that in its previous life it was in an experiment where someone had paired high-pitched noises with an electric shock. And that cowering in the corner of your cage is the best response to a high-pitched noise in that first environment. It's a completely dysfunctional response to a high-pitched noise in a loving classroom. But it is the best response to the environment you grew up in. So if you've got shark music playing in your head all the time, because that is the environment you've grown up in, or go home to from school every day, it helps explain how an innocent bump in the hallway can result in someone turning around and punching the person who accidentally bumped into them. Because they have been on high alert. They've been waiting for that bear to jump out from behind the bush at them. It doesn't excuse it. It's still inappropriate behavior, still has to have consequences, but it explains it.
So I want to make sure that, we talk about being trauma responsive, trauma informed. We talk about having classrooms, schools, districts, communities. And what we have to be clear about is that what it doesn't mean. Okay? It doesn't mean that there aren't any consequences. There are. There has to be. It doesn't mean that because you're trying to be trauma responsive, the environment is unsafe for students or adults. That is not what we're getting at here. And criminal behavior is still criminal behavior. So when we work with our schools and we're seeing in our state, and I know this is across the country, a real desire to kind of break up that school-to-prison pipeline, which is the right, absolutely right thing to do. So we're putting in less punitive discipline systems, but there still has to be a way to keep people safe. There's a mind shift that has to happen, and you have to go from being punitive to restorative, from blaming to understanding. When you've made that switch, you start to think about what happened to this child rather than what's wrong with this child. And it's a fundamental shift in how you perceive the behavior. And empathy, you'll have more empathy, and empathy then builds understanding, and then you're on the road to trying to figure out another way to keep everybody safe, have consequences, all of those things, but you're moving from that punitive mind shift to the restorative, to that idea that this is in every child's control and you're making a bad decision, to maybe understanding that it's not. And it really comes down to two things, which I think is pretty, you're trying to build self-regulation in students, and you're trying to increase social connections. Okay. And so we just use these 3 R's and we talk about it. It's regulate, relate, and respond. And what that means is the first thing you have to do is everybody has to be safe. So if there is a child who's hurting himself, or a child who is out of control in your classroom, and I've had that, threw a chair or wiped everything off my desk and was looking for someone to engage in a fight, you've got to regulate that. Everybody has to be safe. It has to be the first thing that you do. And then before you respond, and respond is the consequence, before you respond, when the child has calmed down, when you've given the child an opportunity to calm down in a safe space, to begin to be able to process what happened, you relate. And what that just means is saying things like, "What? You seemed really angry today. It's not like you. I'm concerned. What's going on?" And 9 times out of 10, the child's going to tell you something. Going to tell you something that may have happened the night before, may have happened this morning, whatever it was that was on his mind or her mind, she will begin to tell you if this child feels like you care. What you're trying to do is say, "I care about you. This behavior is not going to be able to, I'm going to have to do something. You have to have a consequence. You can't go around hitting people." "Yeah, I know. What's the consequence?" So instead of The consequence could be in a timeout room with an adult. It could be what we look at as in-school suspension, but with a therapeutic approach. And I don't mean that they need therapy. I mean that there's somebody kind in there, in the room with them, who can help them figure out what happened so that they can begin to identify triggers and self-regulate. That's the idea. So this just is an interesting slide, because what it actually shows is that intervention works. This is more yours.
Yeah, so this is just showing just what Audrey said, is that for behavioral problems, PTSD, and traumatic stress, when children are engaged in therapy, in a broad sense of the word therapy, I'm not talking about laying on the couch, that you can actually dramatically improve their, both in terms of diagnoses and in terms of behaviors. That this is not immutable, this is treatable, and that's why I don't view this as a depressing talk, because there's things we can do for these kids that will change their whole life trajectory.
Right. And so,
this is one of them. So there's a program called the Positive Parenting Program. It came out of Australia. It's evidence-based. It's a 5-tier program of interventions. Tier 1 is general parenting tips. So things like billboards, ads on the radio or TV, that's Tier 1. Tips about child development and positive parenting that everyone could learn. Tier 2 is training the host of people, kindergarten teachers, first grade teachers, social workers, who are going to interact with troubled children. Tier 3, Tier 4, Tier 5 is intense family therapy. Only a few families are going to need that. But it's a well-defined, scientifically tested, evidence-based program. And they tested it in South Carolina. They took 9 counties in South Carolina and they provided the PPP program. And they took 9 very similar counties, similar in terms of demographics, similar in terms of rural urban, similar in terms of total population, and didn't provide PPP. And what they found in a 2-year period was that they could reduce the number of emergency room visits for child abuse injuries in those 9 counties that got PPP. They reduced the number of calls, the substantiated calls to DCFS, and they decreased placements in foster care. And I don't know about Nebraska, but in Illinois, when we read about kids going into foster care, that is not a good solution. This is not a cheap program. It costs $1.4 million to reach a population of 100,000 children. But it also would reduce the number of children who were maltreated in that 100,000 population by 688. How's that for a precise number? Which means it costs $2,000 per avoided maltreated child. And if you think back to the slide from the Perryman group that I showed you, you're investing to avoid spending $1.8 million. I don't know that. I can do that math.
Compassion fatigue is real. And if the adults who are either the teachers, the administrators, whoever's dealing with children all day, especially children who have a host of issues, they've got to take care of themselves. We often use the analogy of when you're on an airplane and they tell you, and an oxygen masks fall, they tell you to put yours on, the adults first, before you put the child's on. This self-care is a step that people like to skip. And it's absolutely critical. So you're also trying to build resilience. There are ways to build resilience, intervention and support, all those things that we've talked about. Looking at those school discipline policies and moving them to restorative practices, and then relationships. So we know that the relationship that a child has, if they can have that strong buffering relationship, they can't get it at home, they can get it at school. Somebody who actually really cares. So how do you build relationships? You have to look at parental, social connections, knowledge of parenting and child development. Like if you have parent nights, maybe think about, instead of always having the academic piece, think about, is there a way to help parents know more about child development? Give them some tips on how they can support their child in better ways. Concrete support in times of need. That we're talking about the child, we're talking about the child who's out of control, calms down. This is the perfect time to support that child, and we have to pay attention, as we know, to the social and emotional learning and competence of children. So here's David and I, when we first started talking about this, we brought some people together. It wasn't like this. There were 6 of us. We formed, over time, a 501c3 not-for-profit for the Partnership for Resilience. And I'm going to talk a little bit about who's in the partnership and what we do. So that's our mission. And we're trying to integrate education, healthcare, and community organizations to create a trauma-informed, family-focused system that actually measurably improves the academic, health, and social outcomes for students, for children. That's our goal. That's our vision and mission. So, Partnership for Resilience, we are in the Southland, which is the south suburbs of Chicago. It is in Cook County, and these are students that there's high need and low resources. And so I just threw up a couple of statistics so that you can see one of the things that we did. And we started with 3 districts. We had 40 one-on-one conversations, and through those conversations we learned that what the educators were concerned about, one of them was access to primary care. Their kids did not have, even though there was a clinic right across the street from the school, their kids were missing on access to primary care. Behavioral health was another one of the issues they wanted to work on, and then also parental engagement. Okay, so that's how we started. But you can look at, in the 3 districts that we started with, you can see that we have improved in those districts significantly. Some of it was shocking to us. We got a dental van. Something like 50% of the kids had pretty significant issues with their teeth. They needed treatment, okay? And because of this van that we were able to bring to the schools could do the treatment right at school, it got done. And parents did sign the form, and because in the city of Chicago, they do this, but there's a dental van, and they give the student what they need to take to a dentist, all of what they need to have done. And so their rate of completion is much lower, because if you think about what we were talking about, people who don't have cars, people who are working 2 or 3 jobs, the work doesn't get done. But what we have found is that it does. So then we now have 11 school districts in the south suburbs of Chicago, but we also started it's called Resilience Southern Illinois. These are 16 school districts in rural Illinois. And the resources are far and few between. The schools are small. They're geographically diverse, like far away from each other. And so we now are working together with 16 school districts. We're happy to talk about what we do and how we do it and how we started, because we started with $0. We now we've gotten grants, we've attracted some interesting partners that we're happy to work with. One of our partners is the Education Redesign Lab in Harvard. We're like, okay, sure, come to Southern Illinois and help us learn how to really help students in rural districts. Because rural poverty is very real in Illinois and without a lot of resources. So we're learning quite a bit about that as well. So what can educators do? I'm really just going to go through some things very quickly, and I've got the resources for some of this. So, Know Me, Know My Name. How many people, I don't know if you probably haven't never heard of her, but her name is Nelba Marquez Green. And Nelba Marquez Green she's the parent of one of Sandy Hook's victims. And she was a social worker. She is a social worker, and she was involved in this work prior to her daughter, Anna Grace, being killed. And she did a ton of research into Adam Lanza's life. And it was really interesting what she found out. So she found out that both Adam and his mother were both disconnected from community. She located a story that Adam Lanza had written in 5th grade. The cover page showed a grandmother with a cane. He's in 5th grade, wrote the story, and the story is about how this grandmother went into a school and her cane was a gun and she shot kids. So this narrative that somebody snapped and this just happened, this wasn't true in this case. There were signs that people missed. There were all kinds of ways to try to intercede and intrude on Adam Lanza's path. Something that we call Know Me, Know My Name, and it's a no-cost way to find kids like Adam Lanza. And what the schools do, and it's particularly true in large schools, middle schools or high schools, every kid in the school has a name on a paper, and then those papers are put up along the walls. And every adult in the school goes and looks at each name and puts an X if they have a relationship with that child. Not that they know who they are, not that they see them on a grade book, but actually have a relationship. And in every case that we've done this, and every case that she knows of, because she told us about this, there are children with no X's. So what they do is they pull those papers, they make sure that someone is in charge of reaching out and developing a relationship. And the intervention that was first done in a school in San Diego was really light. I think every other week, an adult had lunch with that child. They checked in with them a couple times a week after school, and the results were pretty amazing. Absenteeism went down, grades went up, and referrals went down, because it's often the same kids. So it's a real easy way. 2 by 10 is 2 minutes per day for 10 days, focused on one-on-one positive attention on non-school related conversations. Okay? You're the teacher. You are going to take 2 minutes and for 10 days, and you are going to make sure that you talk to as many kids as you can in those 10 days, and then you start again. 2 minutes. It's just like the research that says that if a teacher stands at the door and says hello to each and every student as they come in, that has a positive effect on behavior. I mean, these are not huge asks, but they make a difference. To teach and practice mindfulness, the research around mindfulness is starting to really show that it helps for kids with trauma because they get 10 minutes in a day and they learn how to be in the moment. And more and more research is starting to say that that impacts. Certainly restorative practices, physical movement actually builds the brain. Cardio activity builds the brain. I always say that when I read that, all I could think about was, well, that's really good for some 60-plus-year-old people who, like, if you're physically active, it's going to help your brain stay healthy, and it works for kids. Goal-directed game playing, because you have to do things like take turns. You are building social skills. It's not a free-for-all, because that's not what helps. And partnering with families and communities, and purposeful curriculum development and text selection. All those things help. So we used to think that this was nature versus nurture, that whatever you were born with in terms of your brain, your IQ, that you couldn't impact that. And we know that's not true, and we know that nurture changes nature. So when I talk to educators about this, and I say, you do this naturally. Most teachers are in front of their students because they want to make a difference. They care about their kids. They care so deeply that sometimes it affects their own health, which is why you have to go back to that self-care. But it also can change the trajectory of a child's life. That's relationship, that buffering relationship helps build resilience and will actually help change a life. My daughter teaches 7th grade, and she called me the other day, and they have one child who they're trying to figure out what to do. In the school, she's very violent. When she's blows up, it's really hard to settle her down, but when she does, and she's talking to the principal, she said to the principal, "Just send me to Ms. Larson. She loves me." And that was someone who, so she felt that care, and it's going to help her then, and Simone then helps her process what happened to her. So here's some resources. I'm assuming that our PowerPoint will go to everyone. These are some of the resources we use. That's the Know Me, Know My Name. We developed a lesson plan. We've got this, we have this ready for any school. The Center on the Developing Child has great resources, a lot of videos that really help 2 to 3 minutes, that really help people understand about brain architecture and science. And then the SAMHSA and the National Child Traumatic Stress Center, there are a lot more, but these are some that we use.
So as a separate publication from the academic study that the CDC put out showing the impact on adult health, they also put out a document called Preventing ACEs, Leveraging the Best Available Evidence, and they've identified 6 things that we should be doing. We should be strengthening economic support to families, because families who have financial security have more time, energy, and brain power to spend on their children. We should be promoting social norms that protect against violence and adversity. We should be ensuring a strong start for children, which means early childhood education, home visitation, high-quality childcare. We need to teach skills. Social-emotional learning is critical. Teaching adolescents about safe dating and healthy relationships. We need to connect youth to caring adults and activities, mentoring programs, after-school programs, and we need to intervene to lessen the immediate and long-term harms. That's enhancing primary care, enhancing the relationship between children and families in primary care, victim-centered services, and treatment, as we've already talked about.
So, expected outcomes, like we don't think small here, right? We're trying to do, as you are, we're really trying to do big things. So expected outcomes are reduced human suffering, decreased costly mental and medical illness, reduction in that healthy risk behaviors, smoking, substance abuse, improved population health and well-being, decrease the generational transmission of ACEs. So moving, just because your parents had adverse childhood experiences and were unable to turn that around for you as a child, you can make a difference for your children. Educational and, improved educational and occupation attainment, decreased crime, and decreasing welfare and social services, and increased productivity and life expectancy. Those are big goals, but if you break them down to individual students, individual classrooms, they're doable. A school can change. A school can become trauma-informed. A school can change the outcomes for their students. It's very possible, and it's doable, but they can't do it alone. And I think that's why this partnership has been so important, and why it's so impressive that you are, as a group of different, we're not just educators, you're not just doctors, you're a group of people who together can support students in this community and their families. And so being able to have those conversations and to figure out how to start, that's something that we would just urge you to do. Start somewhere. Find a school, find a couple districts, find like-minded people who will help you start to change the trajectory for many of your students. So I want to thank you. We do have, I don't know if we have time. Oh, 5 minutes. We tried to have time. For questions and comments, we're happy to answer any question, and also learn from all of you if you have comments about anything that we've said or didn't say, and we should have.